Says, come with me, friends, back to 1913. Our city was then only 61 years old. Indeed, it was barely a city. The population then hovered around 13,000 residents. The city limits did not go far. A person in good physical condition could have walked from line to line in any direction within a matter of minutes. The streets, if paved at all, were so done with brick. Perhaps 2 elite residential streets were paved with concrete, but many still remained dust bowls in summer and near endless mud holes in winter. The era of the automobile, which began about the same time as did our church, had advanced and enlarged a good deal. But most Bristol citizens still rely upon public transportation as means of travel. Our noted streetcar system was still in full swing, but another 5 years would see its demise. Horse and mule-drawn vehicles were still in common use, as was travel on horseback. Hitching rails were still a common sight downtown, and mounting blocks were numerous, both downtown and in residential areas. Y'all know what a mounting block is, don't you? You step up on it and make it easier to get on and off your horse. And yes, many local people resorted to the oldest means of travel, that is, on foot. Some had no other way of going wherever they wanted or needed to go. Some walked over a mile to our church service. I'll just throw in that 1903, when the church started, it's also the year that William Harley and Walter Davidson built their first motorcycle. And by 1913, they were putting out a lot of them, but I think they would have cost you about $450, and that was a lot back then. So a lot of other people that needed to get quickly places that the streetcar didn't go would use bicycles. That was relatively affordable means of transportation. Bristol was then served by 5 railroads, all of which offered passenger service. Indeed, we were then served by 26 passenger trains daily. Can you imagine? Along with numerous freight trains. Other railroads were planned to come here, which would have made Bristol a noted rail center, but alas, they never came. Perhaps this is a good place to mention that the passage of so many trains through the city greatly contributed to a real problem of the town. In 1913, and for many years before and many years that followed, Bristol had a severe pollution problem. Virtually all homes and business houses, along with manufacturing establishments, used coal for whatever purpose was needed. All this, coupled with great clouds of black smoke from passing trains, made for extremely polluted air. It was especially bad in winter, when a black pall hung over the city at all times. And this condition would exist to some degree for at least another 40 years after 1913. Yes, in 1913 and for several years before, we had electrical power and a public water system, but such might be called primitive compared to now. Power failures were common, as were times of muddy or otherwise polluted water. There were still many homes without electrical power, and some were without public water. Many of those who had water only had one spigot in the yard. And I guess I probably don't really need to mention it, but other facilities were often located outside too. That would get to be an interesting experience in the cold winter. In 1913, telephone service had been available for about 25 years, but it still left much to be desired. As many as 10 parties might then share one line. Calling long distance was very limited. There were 2 local telephone companies, making it necessary to have 2 phones to have complete local service. I guess that's not altogether different now. I've got 2 different cell phone carriers to cover different places. Let's see. Virtually all business houses were located downtown. Big box stores, shopping centers, and malls were still years away. One exception to the downtown rule was that there were many grocery stores then operating in residential areas. And speaking of grocery stores, there were 57 operating in Bristol in 1913. Even then, many, perhaps most Bristol homes had backyard vegetable gardens. Some still kept chickens, and here and there one might find a milk cow in a backyard stall. Most yards had a fruit tree or two. Bristol was then noted for wholesale business firms serving a wide area around the city. There were several manufacturing firms employing hundreds of local residents. The variety of manufactured products was truly amazing, varying from beehives to boilers, along with brooms and cook stoves, and other products too numerous to mention. Lucky was the worker in local factories who made $1 per day. There were 4 banks, compare that to now, 5 drugstores, 12 barber shops, 8 of the number were operated by black people, and 22 boarding houses along with 7 hotels. There was no reason to be uninsured. At least 35 insurance agents were working in Bristol at the time. 34 lawyers were then serving the city and area. At the time, 1913, Bristol was considered to be somewhat of a health center. 29 physicians were practicing here, along with 12 dentists. 2 of the physicians were black and 1 was a woman. There was 1 black dentist. Numerous nurses were available, and there were 3, perhaps 4 women who were practicing midwifery. Further, there were several drug makers here. There was 1 hospital out on 10th Street, but it was rather limited in space and services offered. It would be another 12 years before a suitable hospital opened in Bristol. There was then a public school system, but there were differences when compared to now. For one thing, there were no school buses. Getting to school was the responsibility of the students and parents. Most of the students walked, no matter what the distance may have been, and there were no snow days. School was held no matter how adverse the weather may have been. There were 4 colleges here in 1913. This included 1 small business college. In 1913, 33 churches were operating here. 5 of these were black. Most of the older churches, including Central Christian, were located in the downtown section of Bristol. Most of these had active congregations and were headed by dedicated and capable pastors. They were a vital influence in Bristol life. In 1913, Bristol was a good place to live, as it had been for years past and as it still is today.